And my name is Sam Zhao. I'm the director of Center for China-US Cooperation. I saw some new faces, so that's why I want to introduce myself again. Most people in the audience, I think we know very well through many years of our programs. And this is the first one for this academic year. And we are so fortunate to have a very distinguished speaker coming from New Hampshire. Now you are living in New Hampshire, but she has been in Washington for many years and traveled with foreign service husband all over the world. And she has been working on China, one of the most powerful people who have influenced the US policy toward China. In fact, she is going to leave early. She's scheduled to stay here for a couple more days. Was going to speak tonight in Colorado Springs and leaving tomorrow, but she had to change her travel schedule because she's called back to Washington tomorrow afternoon. She will give a briefing on China to all the 47 Democratic senators. Hopefully they get good information. I'm sure they get good information. I'm also surprised that all the senators, they are interested, they are willing to spend a whole hour on China tomorrow. And so that you can see the influence Barbara Finamore has on the policy toward China, which is very important at this moment. So she has been working on many issues. Among them is an environmental issue. In fact, she has a new book published, which also is very influential. We had our bookstore to have the book in display and for sale, but they have not showed up. This first time.
They're on their way. They'll be here soon.
Yeah, Kathleen went to the bookstore and recalled no answer. So Kathleen went to the bookstore. So now they are coming. So if you find the talk is good, which I'm 100% sure will be excellent, you might also want to read the book, get her autograph for the book, which I'm sure you will enjoy it. So the topic Barbara is going to talk is will China save the planet? Big question mark. And without further ado, please join me to welcome Barbara Finamore.
Thank you, Sam, for inviting me. Is this on? No.
Yeah, you have to turn that off.
How's that?
Yeah.
Hello. Hi, everyone. How's that? Closer. Closer to me. Okay. Great. Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Erin, for your wonderful invitation. And thank you to the Center for China-US Cooperation here. It's my delight to be here today. And thanks to all of you for spending this beautiful afternoon here with me to talk about this very important issue. And I especially want to thank the NRDC members who have come to join us today. Raise your hand if you will. Thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. I'm also delighted to be here in Denver and in Colorado, especially following hard on the heels of the governor's passage of some very important climate and energy and electric vehicle legislation, which NRDC colleagues here in Denver really helped to promote. And I understand that now, with this legislation and another roadmap, that Colorado is on its way to move to 100% renewable energy by 2040. So congratulations to everyone here in the room. That's a real path-breaking work. Thank you. Thank you for all your work. And do I come here? Yes. Why is this important? Why is this important? Because as you know, as we speak, we are experiencing a climate emergency, the likes of which the human race has never seen before. And just in the last few weeks, we experienced the strongest Atlantic storm at landfall in history. And last year, the continental US experienced the most heavy rainfall and flooding since modern record keeping began. And I'm guessing maybe that means that they didn't include Noah's Ark. And last year, following one of the worst wildfire seasons in the United States, the chief of the US Forest Service is warning that 1 billion acres of land throughout the United States are subject at the risk of catastrophic wildfires, similar to the Camp Fire in California that destroyed Paradise in many ways. Yet we are also at the cusp of a paradigm shift in energy use, as profound as the shift from burning wood to burning coal 2 centuries ago. But we have to accelerate that energy transformation at a speed, at a scale that is unprecedented in human history. Because if we don't act now to cut our CO2 emissions in half by 2030, we won't have a chance of averting the most catastrophic impacts of climate change. It's that simple. Can we make that change fast enough? Well, through my 30 years of working in China and my understanding of that country's evolution to a world power, I am convinced that China stands at the very center of this critical crossroads. It is the world's largest CO2 emitter, but at the same time, the decisions that China is making and will make are going to affect our way of life here in ways that we cannot even imagine right now. So with the US government stepping back from leadership on climate change, the question is, will China save the planet? And that remains to be seen. When I first moved to Beijing in 1990, winter meant cold. Every year on November 15th, the government of the city and other northern cities would switch on the central heating system, and immediately the skies, I see you nodding your head, the skies would darken and our faces and clothes would become covered with soot. And people would stockpile coal all over the city to be used for heating and cooking. And right within the city limits were 4 large coal-fired power plants and the world's largest steel mill. When I started NRDC's China Clean Energy Project, which was we were the first international environmental NGO to do so in China. It was a lonely enterprise. And I used to joke that our Beijing office was one man with a cell phone, which it was for many years. But it was the very first of NRDC's growing global network of people and programs and offices that are working to save the planet. Coal is the reason why China is by far the leading emitter of greenhouse gases. But it's important to note that its per capita emissions are far below those of us here in the United States. And China's evolution from a developing country to a global force really started to take off in 2001 when it joined the WTO and became the world's manufacturing hub. And during that decade of China's economic miracle, it quadrupled its GDP, it quintupled its exports, and it tripled its coal consumption. That's what we're seeing here in this China's version of the climate change hockey stick. And it was also during that time in 2006 that China overtook the US as the leading emitter of greenhouse gases. But it was also during the middle of that decade that China began to realize that its single-minded focus on GDP growth was not enough to ensure a high quality of life for its citizens, and that its very development model, based on exports, heavy industry, and powered by coal, was simply unsustainable and was leaving a trail of environmental destruction in its wake. And the key turning point in my mind was 2013, the year of China's what's known as airpocalypse. That was the year, you may remember, when the air in Beijing and other northern cities was as if people were living in an airport smoking lounge. And in fact, studies showed that it was equivalent to having every man, woman, and child smoking 1.3 cigarettes every hour. 4,000 people were dying a day. And people had to wear face masks to go outside. When China started making data about air pollution available to the public concern rose dramatically, and the country knew it needed to do something. And by the end of that year, it had launched a 1.7 trillion renminbi air pollution action plan. And it was targeted at coal use in its most polluted regions. At that time also, NRDC brought together 20 of China's leading stakeholder groups, research institutes, academic programs, even industry associations. And we worked together to successfully advocate for a mandatory national cap on China's coal consumption, which is in the current 5-year plan. So that was when China first started to move on coal, with incredible results for the climate. Because after growing in double digits for over a decade, China's CO2 emissions stabilized in 2013. And then they began to drop for the next 3 years. And because China's carbon footprint is so outsized, that meant that global CO2 emissions also stabilized during that period. But it's not easy to turn the world's second largest economy, home to 1/2 of the world's coal consumption, iron and steel and cement production, around to a low carbon economy. And it's still a bumpy road, at least in the short term. So what we've seen in the last couple of years is China's coal consumption and CO2 emissions start to go up, though at a much lower level than before. They have still not reached that 2013 peak. And why do you think that's happening? Well, a number of reasons, but one of them is the slowing economy, exacerbated by the trade war between the US and China. And what that has done is, in my view, embolden the voices within China who want it to slow down and who like and profited from the status quo, the smokestack industries, local governments whose own economies were built on coal. And so these voices have been in ascendance, and what China has been doing recently is what worked in the past to jigger its slowing economy. Economic stimulus to infrastructure production, which means more iron and steel and cement production, all powered by coal. Rather than using this as an opportunity to do what it says it wants to do, transition to a new type of economy based on services, move away from that heavy industry model. But it's not easy to do. And one other, I had to show you this graph when I saw it, it blew my mind. One other reason coal plants, coal consumption has gone up is because of the kind of resistance of local governments. So right after it launched its air pollution action plan, it was also trying to streamline its bloated bureaucracy. So among other things, China delegated to these local governments the authority to permit new coal-fired power plants, figuring they would know what was needed. but it didn't work that way. Local governments saw an opportunity and they rushed to approve as many new coal plants as they could because they thought it would help their economy, help create jobs, and none of these plants were needed. None of these plants were needed, but the rules of China's grid at that time, and still largely today, were such that building new coal plants was virtually risk-free. Every new plant was guaranteed a fixed number of operating hours and a fixed price. So as more and more coal plants entered into the grid, they're all running, half of the time because they're just not needed. And more than half of China's coal plants are operating at a loss right now, and many of them are starting to face bankruptcy. But China has to deal with that incredible glut of new coal-fired power plants right now. So NRDC is continuing to work with our coal cap team for making detailed recommendations and developing policies that will help China to move ahead with that coal transition away from coal. So here's just some of the recommendations that we have proposed that are being listened to carefully. But I think the most important one is to rewrite the rules of the game, the rules of the grid, to provide a level playing field for renewable energy. Because the one thing that is so obvious to me right now is that that transition to renewable energy in China and throughout the world as a result is accelerating rapidly. China recognizes that clean energy is important, not just for the health of its people, not just to protect its environment, but it's also the leading market opportunity of the 21st century. And China is determined to take the lead. And clean energy also means jobs, good jobs. China leads the world now in clean energy jobs, 4 million as of last year. There's more people working in clean energy in China than in coal mining. And it was also in that pivotal year of 2013 that China overtook the US as the leading investor in renewable energy, and it's never looked back. In fact, in 2017, China invested more in renewable energy than the next 3 global investors put together. That's the US, the EU, and Japan. And even last year, as China is seeking to cut the subsidies, the heavy subsidies that's provided to solar energy through the years, it's still invested nearly twice as much as the United States in renewable energy. And all that investment, China's policies, its programs, its R&D, its government procurement, the whole package has really begun to pay off because China is now the world leader in solar and in wind and in hydropower and in many other forms of renewable energy. To the extent that China now owns 1 out of every 3 solar panels in the world and 1 out of every 3 wind turbines. But the real exciting news for me is the story of solar. Because 10 years ago, China had no domestic solar industry, if you can imagine. If you added up all the power it was producing through solar energy, it was less than the city of San Antonio, Texas, is producing today. But it, at the same time, was the leading producer, manufacturer of solar panels, and it was providing 95% of the world market. But then when the 2008 economic recession hit, Germany and other countries that were buying these panels cut their subsidies and the bottom fell out of the global market. So China decided that it would develop its own domestic industry. And that's when you see the power that China has when it declares an industry to be a strategic industry and does everything necessary to move it forward. The results are amazing. And that's what it did for solar power. Just in those last 10 years, China has now moved ahead. It has installed, again, more solar energy in 2017 than it did for coal, nuclear, and gas put together. And it now has, from that inauspicious beginning, nearly 3 times as much solar panels as the United States, which invented the solar cell. But China is moving ahead on this. And why does that matter? Why does that matter? Here it is. You can see how fast China is growing on this, even after it cut the subsidies. Because what it realized last year is the cost of solar in China and throughout the world has dropped 80% in the last 10 years. And it didn't need subsidies anymore. So China cut the subsidies. And what happened? So the price of solar dropped 35% more just in the last year. And so what is most exciting to me is that we are seeing a tipping point throughout the world where solar power is cheaper to produce than coal power in many, many parts of the world. And in 11 provinces in China this year, that will also be the case. And even more exciting, it's coming up very soon, as you can see, to a situation where it will be cheaper, and it already is true in many parts of this country. It will soon be cheaper to build new wind and solar plants and include the energy storage so they can be a stable source of electricity, cheaper to build new renewable energy than to buy the coal for existing plants. So we have a situation where the International Energy Agency is predicting that solar energy, that little boutique source of energy, will become the leading source of power in the world by 2050. Thanks in large part to what China has done. Now this is a picture of the world's largest floating solar power plant, which China turned on last year. And where is it located? On top of a submerged coal mine.
Yeah.
So to my mind, this is the best symbol of that clean energy revolution that I'm talking about. But I also couldn't resist showing you this one. Nonetheless, despite all this progress, our world energy system is still 2/3 fossil fuel. But thanks to China's clean energy leadership, which is another form of climate leadership, we are on a trajectory now where we could reach 50% renewables by 2050. But unfortunately, that's not enough. So the UN International Panel of Climate Change Scientists, the IPCC, has said in a blockbuster report that came out last fall that we need to, as a world energy system, get to at least up to 85% renewables by 2050. And that's a real acceleration. The NRDC is working with China to help overcome a lot of those obstacles and to help them develop a 21st century grid. But the US faces the same problem. Every country that's trying to integrate larger and larger amounts of renewables faces these same problems. And I believe there is a tremendous opportunity for the US and China to cooperate, as they used to do, on together accelerating this clean energy revolution. I believe it's in the best interest of both countries. To my mind, the key competition is not between the United States and China. It's between solar and coal. Another way in which China is really doing more than any other country to move forward this clean energy revolution is with electric vehicles. And interestingly enough, it was also in 2013 that China launched this moonshot to lead the world in electric vehicles. And boy, has it. In those 5-6 years now, China's spent $60 billion in subsidies for purchase of electric vehicles, for R&D, for charging infrastructure, and so forth. 10 times more than the United States. And so again, we are seeing the same kind of rapid growth in just the last few years that most people are just not aware of, how China has become the world leader in electric vehicles, electric taxis, electric buses, electric charging infrastructure, and electric battery production, where Tesla is building a battery gigafactory in the desert. China is building 20 giga cities for battery production. And they brought the cost down of those batteries for everybody, 75% in just those 6 years. To the point where it's looking now that buying an electric vehicle is going to be cost competitive with an internal combustion engine vehicle within 5 years or less, depending on the market. So again, what China has done is having reverberations for the clean energy, the climate race everywhere in the world. China, whole cities in China have changed their entire taxi fleet and ride-sharing companies to electric vehicles, because it's not just cars. In fact, it's better for China to electrify other forms of transport. And it really is focusing primarily on e-buses. 99% of the world market in electric buses is China's. They've already electrified 1/4 of their buses. And again, entire cities have already transformed their entire fleet. They don't wait like we do until a bus reaches the end of its useful life and then switch it. They're going full hog for entire fleets at once. And in fact, in May, the central government issued a new e-bus order to every local government that they must come up with a plan for transitioning all their buses to electric ones. What I should also mention is that NRDC, we now have an oil cap project. Again, trying to figure out how China can cap its oil consumption, which is growing rapidly. The increase in demand each year is equal to the oil consumption of a medium-sized country. And that's one of the main reasons why China is moving towards electric vehicles, is energy security. Even though right now, a lot of the electricity that's powering these vehicles is powered by coal. But as it cleans up its grid, it's going to have even better impacts on the environment. So they're taking the long view on that. But we came out with a report a few months ago that laid out a plan, a roadmap for China to completely phase out all of its vehicles, buses, taxis, cars, by 2030. And just the other day, the Chinese government announced that it will investigate and develop such a plan to completely phase out these electric vehicles, starting with pilot projects that we will help them work on. So again, wonderful news, but put it in perspective. Electric vehicles are still only a very tiny fraction of the global car fleet. Though when I started giving this talk, when my book came out last fall, it was 2%. So it's changing fast. But is that enough? Oh well, I should say, because of what China is doing on electric vehicles, we're now on a trajectory to reach 50%, like with renewable energy, 50% global electric vehicles by 2050. But is that enough? No, the IPCC says that 65% of all electric all transport must be low or no emission by 2050 if we're going to have a prayer of addressing climate change. So much work needs to be done in China and elsewhere. There are still a tremendous amount of challenges. China has been selling electric vehicles so fast that even though it has the largest charging infrastructure in the world, it's not enough. Just to give you an example, and one of our projects is to work with Shanghai and the first pilot project in China to figure out how to integrate all this new charging into the grid, because it's going to put a tremendous strain on that grid. And we want to make sure that the timing of the charging of electric vehicles is managed so that it's using renewable energy. And Shanghai needs to do that because it has no opportunity anymore. Its grid is completely built out. It can't build anymore. So it's very interested in working with us on these innovative efforts. But finally, China's carbon footprint is not just within its own borders. It is now spreading across the world through the Belt and Road Initiative. How many have heard of this? Many, everybody, okay. Good. Because it is, I think, critical, the decisions that China makes on what type, particularly of energy infrastructure, it's going to be financing in these 128 countries in the coming years. Because together, those countries are right now responsible for about 28% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. Now that's very similar to the amount China itself is responsible for. However, if we go ahead with business as usual in the BRI, China's own experts predict that these countries' emissions could total as much as 66% of world emissions by 2030. And this would be twice as much as the amount of emissions we need to limit ourselves to avoid going over just 2% global warming. Unfortunately, China at this time is still financing, along with Japan and Korea, 1/4 of the coal plants that are being planned or built in these Belt and Road countries. And even in 2018, 40% of China's financing for energy went to coal plants. So this is very worrisome. On the other hand, China's loans for renewable energy are growing fast too, but they're still not caught up to those for coal and other fossil fuels. And it's interesting to note that what we've got here is a situation where the renewable energy is being financed by private companies in China who recognize that this is the real market opportunity for them to get a return on their investment. The financing of coal plants is mostly by state-owned enterprises and government banks. So they're not looking at the market opportunities here, the potential for enormous stranded assets, these countries never being able to pay off the debt of these coal plants or to recover their investments. But China has, because of what it's done, not just in building the hardware for solar and wind, but in putting these policies in place and for putting a subsidy system in place that was very successful, and now in figuring out how to scale back those subsidies when they're no longer needed. China has an unparalleled set of experience and expertise in how to help these other countries develop their renewable energy systems so that they can accept growing numbers of renewable energy. And if China were to focus on that, perhaps with the help of the United States together, it could make a huge dent in our global climate footprint. So NRDC is a member of one of 10 working groups that the government of China has set up with experts all around the world to advise them on how to green the Belt and Road. And our particular working group builds on our expertise both in the US and in China, which has always been laws, standards, and regulations. And so we've already begun putting together a series of reports of some ideas on how China can put teeth into the guidelines that it already has in place for greening the Belt and Road, but which are not yet mandatory. So these are just some of the ideas that we have put out to really bring China in line with 100 investors, banks, and others around the world who will have declared that they will no longer invest in fossil fuels, and to ensure that China complies with best international practice of other financial institutions. But it's also really important that the recipient countries do everything they can to ensure that these investments as part of the Belt and Road comply with the highest environmental standards, because really what China is saying is we defer. We defer to the standards and desires of the recipient countries. So the countries, there's a series of suggestions that we've made as well on what these host countries can do to ensure that the Belt and Road development is green, environmentally sustainable, and in line with what its own citizens want, as well as with the Paris Agreement. But there's going to be a lot of work that needs to be done in each of these countries to help them get to where they need to be. So here are a couple of photos of Beijing, taken a few years ago, from my office window there, 5 days apart. And one of them, it's crystal clear, just like it is here in Denver today. And in the other one, the pollution is so bad, you can barely make out the shape of the buildings. I think this shows more than anything that China is at that center of crossroads and making decisions now that will have perhaps greater impact than those of any country on its own prosperity, its own environment, and the future of our planet. And here's another picture. This is my Beijing office today. We've now grown from one fellow with a cell phone to 50 lawyers, policy experts, technical experts, conservationists, and fellows. Almost all of them are Chinese citizens. And they understand that China is at a crossroads. And they are doing everything they can to help China move the right way forward. And I'm very excited that just a couple of weeks ago, my energy team in Beijing met with China's chief climate negotiator, Minister Xie Jianhua, and his team. We were asked to present on our work with the coal cap team and the oil cap team. And we also took that opportunity to present our recommendations for how China can strengthen its Paris Agreement target. Now, just in June, at the G20 meeting in Osaka, China and France issued a joint press release in which they committed to strengthening their Paris climate targets to reflect the highest possible ambition and to come out with long-term plans for greenhouse gas reductions in the next couple of years. Now, this is what we used to see between the US and China. US and China issued under the Obama administration, issued a series of bilateral agreements that really pushed every country in the world forward to come to an agreement in Paris, and it also sped up the speed with which that agreement came into force. China likes to work in partnership with other of the largest emitters. Perhaps, I know they're talking with the EU right now, but it's time for the US to step back in, because when the two largest emitters work together, that's when we can make the most progress. And Minister Xie liked our recommendations. So let's see what happens at the UN Climate Summit next week. We don't expect China or any other country to make brand new commitments then, but it's December 2020 that every country agreed in the Paris Agreement that they would come up with new and stronger targets. Because if you add together all of the targets that every country made in Paris, they don't take us even 1/3 of the way where we need to go to meet the goals of that agreement. There's a lot of work to be done. So I urge you, as our climate emergency gets more and more serious, to think about things that you can do to make a difference. I urge you to buy the book, share it with a friend, and to vote. I want to leave you with the Chinese proverb that I may have made up. And it goes like this: when the winds of change blow, some people build walls and others build windmills. Thank you very much.
That's what China now tries to tell the world. The US is building the wall. China is building the road, Belt and roads. That's what.
Windmills.
And windmills, yeah. But in any case, I think this is a very powerful speech, and hopefully you all have enjoyed that. When she mentioned that NRDC, I think for those who are not familiar with the name, is the Natural Resources Defense Council. Is a major global NGO working on that issues. She has a very important role in that organization. And now the floor is open. And please to be very brief when you ask questions. Identify yourselves and with a question mark, as we always asked. Okay, the floor is open. Okay, here.
My name is Carla Meyer. I have two questions. One is, during the Obama administration, I remember reading an article about how because the speed with which China can build new coal plants, that so many American scientists were going over to try to study the whole area of clean coal. And I was wondering if that's just totally off the table now. That's my first question. And then my second question was, okay, when you're talking about that solar power is almost as cheap as coal power, right? Is that using the Chinese figures? Because if that were true, then why wouldn't they be building more solar infrastructure in the roads and the roads initiative?
All good questions. Okay, so I'll answer your second question first. These are not China's figures, although their own figures corroborate the cheapness of coal. There's been studies done all over the world. But that's not the only reason. That's not the main reason, I think, why China is financing coal plants overseas. And it has to do with what I said earlier. It's the private companies that are financing the renewable energy because it is the cheapest, because they can get the best return on their investment, because the market is clear. The market signal is clear. But in a sense, it's almost as if China is outsourcing its fossil fuel industry, which is coming under, a lot of pressure to close down in China itself because of air pollution, because of climate change. And so when they are financing these coal plants overseas, they often bring workers to do the work, engineering, procurement firms. It's the state-owned industries that are owning the stake in these coal plants. So there's a little bit of concern here that that's what's moving. It's not the market signals itself, because that would come up with a very different result. What was your first question again? I'm sorry.
Oh, it was about is clean coal a non-issue in the world now?
I and many others do not believe there is such a thing as clean coal. Because, I mean, to be fair, all the new coal plants that it's building in China, it has more stringent regulations on how efficient they need to be than any place else in the world. They have to be what's called ultra super critical. They get as much out of a lump of coal as anybody else, but it's still a lump of coal. They have to put very advanced pollution control equipment on every coal plant in China. But that equipment doesn't have any mechanism for capturing the CO2. To do that requires something called carbon capture and sequestration, which was of great interest for both the US and China at one point. However, right now, it is by far the most expensive way to generate a megawatt of electricity anywhere in the world. So as solar and wind become cheaper, China's fundamentally changed the economics of energy throughout the world. And it makes more sense just to close those coal plants down than to build untested and very expensive new equipment and then figure out how to inject that CO2 underground in order to store it for the foreseeable future.
We have quite a few. We have 2 of our faculty members, 1 student, so let's get all 3.
Sure.
You start.
Thank you. My name is Cullen Hendricks. I'm on the faculty at the Korbel School. I thought you did a masterful job of outlining the way in which, in both solar and in electric vehicles, you have the creation of better mousetraps. But we know that the makers of the old worst mousetraps are not likely to go quietly into the night, or at least wouldn't in kind of a democratic capitalist society. So can you talk a little bit about, I guess, for lack of a better term, the political economy of that transition and how China's managing the shuttering of the coal plants, the effects that has on local employment, and any kind of grievances or mobilization that may be associated therewith? Thank you.
Let's take two questions.
Two questions.
Oh, we have another colleague, quite a few colleagues. Let's.
Just keep me on, put me on the list after the other.
Okay, okay.
Yeah, actually, I'm Dale Rothman. I'm on the faculty too, and I have to leave quickly to teach a class on environment development. But I think you pretty much answered. Is China sort of given up completely on the concept of carbon capture and storage, even in the state-run facilities? Because the way you described the distinction between the state-run and the private.
You know, China hasn't given up on any form of energy yet. It is still at a small scale doing testing of carbon capture and sequestration development projects. It's particularly interested in the idea of using that CO2 to inject into oil fields to help enhance the oil recovery. But what it's doing, as I said before, it's trying to get rid of subsidies for coal. It's trying to get rid of subsidies for solar and wind. It reduced the subsidies for nuclear. So it's trying to move its entire energy system into a market-based one. And that's what's going to make it so hard to compete for these very expensive technologies. And it recognizes that. Yeah. And on your question about the political economy, I tried to outline what really pushed China to begin to address its growing coal consumption. And it really was that public concern. That is what was pushing it. And that's what continues to drive China's efforts, because it wants to ensure a good quality of life and that people are happy. So it has a new air pollution control plan in place that has new targets that have to be met by the end of 2020. And that's going to be tough. It's going to be tough because it has also been, at the same time, loosening some air pollution restrictions because of the slowing economy. So these are two often conflicting goals of the government. You know, keeping that economic development very high, while at the same time transitioning away. That is the key decisions that China has to make.
Thank you.
Okay.
Do you have a student?
Oh, we have a student.
Was there a student who wanted to ask?
Okay, Pat.
I work for SAM. My name is Tad. I work for the CCUSC. And I had a question, two different questions. I lived in China during the air apocalypse. Slightly worried about myself now. But regularly when I'd pull up an app or look online, the pollution ratings were a lot higher for the U.S. consulate and foreign consulates and embassies compared to what the Chinese government was reporting. Compared to all of your numbers there, I was wondering if you had any questions about the validity of what the Chinese government was reporting to you, as well as my second question was kind of comparing government structures, having the Chinese government be very much authoritarian and have a lot of its hands in those private industries and excess industries. How big of a difference is that compared to our democracy, which a lot of people are not even believing in climate change at this point to be able to move that giant ship around?
All good questions. And you point out a very important development in 2013 that I think contributed quite a bit. And that was that the United States Embassy decided to put an air quality monitor on the roof of the embassy because of the concerns of the families that were serving there. And then it was tweeting out the results to the public. And they were different numbers. And also at that time, they were using EPA's rating scale. And China had its own rating scale where even if you had the same amount of pollution, it would be considered very, in the red zone for the US system, but okay for the Chinese system. And so as a result of I think, this greater transparency, China has been changing its pollution rating system. And what you've got now is all these apps. Anyone who's in China knows where you can check the air quality of your city in China on an hourly basis right now. They have expanded these monitoring systems throughout all of the major cities. So it's still a work in progress, but compared to where it was, when people had no idea that it was actually smog, I would go out with friends and they say, boy, it's a foggy day. You know, until the situation now where every single person in China knows what PM 2.5 means. That's these tiny particulates in air pollution that have the most adverse health impact. Most people in this country happily don't need to know about that. So your other question was?
About the Chinese governmental system and the U.S. governmental system and the choice from Xi Jinping downward to be able to switch that around compared to our government.
Right, right. So Xi Jinping has enshrined a circular economy in the Chinese constitution and has made environmental protection a top priority, unlike our current president. What that means, as I tried to say before, is when they declared that solar energy was a strategic industry, it pulled out all the stops. And that's something that's very hard for us to do in this country. There seems to be, you know, aversion to the idea of industrial policy in this country, but I think it makes a huge difference. Unfortunately, I think at this point that China is in a transition phase where that command and control approach is having limited, diminishing returns. And really what it needs to do is to set up a market system, which it's trying to do, a competitive market system where solar and wind can compete on a level playing field without subsidies from coal. And China has also launched what could become the world's largest carbon trading market. Focused first on the power sector, but it's taking a lot of time. It's very difficult to do because that's a market mechanism. And the power sector isn't governed by market principles in China. China's in that transition stage. So really, it is looking to the US in many ways, and to California and to Europe for ideas on how to take those principles, those market principles that have been successful, and apply them to China's particular conditions. It's not easy.
Okay, Eddie.
I wanted to thank you for your work, which is super important in saving the planet, and much better than what is standardly said around here, where snarling at China rather than dealing with China is the reflex ideological reaction. I was in China because Sam helped arrange an appointment with Liao Ning several years ago, and you could see the immense energy in building and also the pollution. And I spent time in Beijing, it was even sharper. And there are two aspects of this I want to discuss, which are broad strategic aspects. One of them, I spent a lot of time with Tibetans, and the Chinese are destroying the water at the roof of the world that waters Asia through dams. And it's a mirror of standard life. They have built 26,000 dams. They plant them on indigenous people, you know, drive a lot of people out, poison the waters. All the rest of the world has built 13,000 dams. So if we export military bases and weapons, the leading aspect of the United States, if I may say at the moment, they seem to be exporting dams. And that was quite horrible. And if you want, I can tell you more about it. But I'll just say this is a great alternative. And so I just wanted to ask you about if you know about the dams and how far this has gone. Here's the other side of it just quickly. They have a one-child policy, which means that even people in the Communist Party don't want their children going out and getting killed in the wars. And we're the ones who surround them with military bases and all this stuff, and have waged wars in the area. And there's a chance that they can conquer the world for green energy since we're too crazy. And I wouldn't recommend the Republican so-called party as a democratic organization anymore. I don't see that it's for democracy in any way. It seems like a party committed to lies and racism. And I think this is what we've found here is very, very important. But I just wanted to say, this is the rational thing for China, given you can't breathe there, to do, right? I mean, no, you can't breathe there. So anyway, I just wonder if you have any reflections on either side.
No, you're very right about the dams. It's important to note that most definitions of renewable energy do not include large-scale hydropower dams because of their environmental impact, but they do include small-scale dams, and there is a huge potential in China for building more small-scale dams, but it's not being realized. And I think this is very short-sighted, and I also want to point out that China is one of the countries that is most water scarce in the world. The average per capita water supply in China is 1/7 of the world average. And what we're seeing because of climate change, this is one of the areas where China is most vulnerable, as we see more droughts in China. And what it's doing is lowering the water table in all the rivers that are dammed up so that they are not producing nearly as much power as was originally anticipated, and that's only going to get worse.
Okay, Steve.
Steve Thomas, very briefly, do you see that the Chinese government is beginning to be more interested in facts? And this is kind of an embarrassing question given our current leadership, but we do still have a free press, and we do criticize fake news when we see it even from our president. Is China getting more in that kind of mode because traditionally they have not been interested in hearing the bad news about anything?
Not really, not really. China has a state-controlled media, and that hasn't changed at all. In fact, it's become more tied into what the government wants to say. But it's oddly enough, in the case of climate change, this is perversely a positive thing, because they don't have a situation that we have in the United States where a TV reporter will bring two experts, one of whom represents 99% of the world's scientists, and one person representing his own opinion that climate change it doesn't exist. So in order to sell, get viewership and readership, that's what we're seeing in the United States. So a lot of people, there are more climate change skeptics in the US by far than in any other country. But in China, there was a recent poll that came out 4 days ago where they analyzed 30,000 people in 28 countries to see what they thought. Is climate change happening? Is it human caused? Is it affecting you personally? And China came out as one of the countries where people really understand that it is happening, that it is largely caused by human activity, and that it's affecting them personally. And a local environmental group did a couple of polls a few years ago, 2017, they redid it. And they found that most of the respondents in China were willing to spend a little bit more in order to help green their purchases and lower their own carbon footprint. So I think that's a real positive impact. And China can do more because it doesn't have to deal with that skepticism.
Thank you for your work.
We see quite a few. Let's collect all the questions. Then
Well, no,
decide.
because you see I'm not remembering
No,
what
you
one
don't
at
have
a
to
time.
remember them. You just find which one is interesting.
Oh, okay. I'm sure yours is interesting, Richard.
Just
presentation, Barbara.
Thank you.
I'm curious, everything I've read says that even if we make great progress in the coming decades in climate change, there is still going to be an impact in many, many areas around the world. Rising sea levels, inundating port cities, et cetera, et cetera. Have you worked with China? Do you have a sense of what they're doing to plan for the worst possible outcomes?
Okay, let's connect another one.
John Grant from Fort Collins. Will I find anything in your book about green GDP calculations and any of those machinations?
Okay.
Okay. Here.
You can comment about the NGO in China with my friends in China abandoning their white-collar job to be volunteers, I wonder how much will China's single planet is really will Chinese people single planet. So I wonder, because the government wants stability, they're responding to the people, but how much is the people really influence that?
Okay, you have 2 seconds to answer them.
Okay, 2 seconds. Okay, and now you have to remind me. I told you don't make me listen to
What are they doing to mitigate, even if there is reduction and
yeah.
so on, what are they doing to mitigate some of the worst aspects of it?
Yes. So actually, a couple of years ago, China issued a very thick national climate adaptation plan because they recognize that they have to take action. It's very comprehensive. But we're also seeing cities like Shanghai in particular working very hard to develop their own climate resiliency, adaptation measures, because, I mean, Shanghai's already sinking, right? There's a groundwater is being taken up. They're one of the 3 mega cities in China that is the most vulnerable in the world, of all world cities, to the impacts of climate change. So they're developing their own early warning system, and they're building infrastructure to try and protect them. And we're seeing that more and more in China itself.
Green GDP.
Green GDP, good question. There was a effort led by a fellow who was the head of the China's EPA at the time, to develop a new system for determining GDP of municipalities and provinces of the country. And that would be the green GDP system, where you look at economic production and then you subtract the use of natural resources and also the impact, environmental impact. It would have made a huge difference, but there was so much resistance from those powerful vested interests, those smokestack industries in the provinces where they predominate, that it was abandoned, unfortunately. And your question about Chinese people, yes. Well, the survey I mentioned done by the local NGO also found at least most of the respondents saying they felt confident that the Chinese government would take care of the problem. But I'm seeing growing awareness, and you are too, it sounds like, of people needing to take individual action. And we're seeing that all over the world, right, with the young people. There's probably, this Friday there's going to be climate strikes here in Denver and all around the country, and I think the world. Yeah. And I hope that we're seeing that impact in China too. So it's just beginning. It's just beginning. But I think there's a lot more potential. Well, certainly, I mean, look at things like electric bikes. I didn't even talk about that. That was not an initiative led by the Chinese government. But China leads the world also in electric bikes, so much so that they've gotten to be a problem in many municipalities. There's just too many of them. But I think we're seeing a lot of opportunity for individuals to make a difference in China, just like everywhere else.
Okay, last question, give the most important person. Okay, you too. Yeah, okay.
Where does China stand on natural gas, use of natural gas?
Okay.
Kind of similar. What's the role of nuclear power in this transition?
Yeah. So China, for natural gas, it has its own sources domestically of natural gas, but they're not very big. And so through the years, they've always decided to focus its domestic natural gas use on industrial processes rather than power production. But in recent years, the biggest and growing use of natural gas in China is to switch. Remember that first slide I showed you of the coal stockpiled outside of people's homes for heating and cooking? This is a major source of pollution because you can't put a scrubber on it. And China has been working to switch people's homes in rural areas and small companies away from coal to use natural gas. They went a little bit too far the year before last and required all these towns around Beijing to switch to natural gas. The price skyrocketed, there wasn't the supply available, and a lot of people had trouble keeping warm that winter. So now they're looking at other sources of energy for that switch. But China is now the major driver of price of LNG in the world. It's importing, but not for power production. They've never wanted to go that route. And similarly with nuclear, China is gung-ho on nuclear. They are doing more research and development on other, ways to use nuclear power to generate electricity. But it's not going very far, very fast. After the Fukushima accident a few years ago in neighboring Japan, China put a moratorium on all nuclear development, and ever since that time it will not consider any nuclear power plants other than in coastal areas, because there just isn't enough water. And coastal areas are where there's the most population. So it's very concerned about the risks of another accident. It's not going to meet its targets for nuclear power at the end of the current 5-year plan next year. It hasn't approved any new plants. It's only starting to consider a couple of new ones now. And I think the real problem, again, is economic. When it announced recent tariffs for existing nuclear plants, they were a lot lower than the industry expected. So nuclear power producers are not going, as China moves to this market-based system, they're getting rid of subsidies for nuclear as well, and they're not going to be able to recover their investment in light of the rapidly dropping costs of solar and wind. That really is how China has changed fundamentally, disrupting the status quo on energy use. They just can't compete anymore.
With that, let's conclude the presentation, because she has to fly to Washington back to brief those 47 Democratic senators. Hopefully they will get as much from 1 hour meeting with her tomorrow as we got today. And the most important thing here is that we have a book. A book there. I saw quite a few people already got the books. They are going fast. They are going away fast. Hopefully you buy the book and get her signature on the book. I'm sure she will be happy to do that. Okay, and we have more events coming in the order. Please look for our announcements. I saw blue faces. If you are interested in our events, please go CCUSC, get to send an email to us. We'll add you to our email list to find our events. Please join me again to thank Barbara Finamore for such wonderful presentation. Good job. Thank you.